There are many ways to handle HTTP requests in .NET, and HttpClient seems to be the easiest. Unfortunately, it's very easy to misuse it. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the worst and the best way to implement HttpClient in your .NET application. So let's jump into the code. I have here an API project where I have a Pokemon service and an API that will get me a Pokemon, basically. I need to implement the Pokemon service, which is still not implemented. I need to implement an HTTP client to request an HTTP GET from Poke API. Okay, so let's start with the first implementation, which is the naive way that you shouldn't do. Okay, so you can do something like this: var client equal new HTTP client, and then client dot base address equal new URI, and you provide the Poke API URL. Okay, and then you can do something like this: var Pokemon equal await client, change this into async. So client dot get from JSON, and we can specify the Pokemon here, and the API is Pokemon / the name. Okay, now we can return Pokemon. Nice. Here we should be able to query the Pokemon depending on the name that we are getting from the request. So let's start. Okay, and I'm going to use curl in my terminal to query the API. Make sure to subscribe. So I can do something like this. So curl the API Pokemon Bulbasaur, but I think the API port is different, which is 5092. Notice here, we are getting a response. So Bulbasaur has an ID of 1 and he's weight 69. Okay, so our HTTP client implementation is valid, is correct. But you will notice that every time we query the API, we are creating a new HTTP client, which is wrong. So you will think, okay, I can optimize the code by moving my implementation of my declaration and initialization into the constructor. So I can do something like this. So private read only HTTP client, nice. And then I can move this logic here into the constructor, which is doable. So client equal new HTTP client, then you set the base address, and you will use the instance there. And now, anytime I'm calling the Pokemon service, I will get the same instance that I created there. Well, basically, if I'm calling it multiple times inside the same request, because it's been registered as transient. But that is also fine. I can run it now. Run, and then we can query it again. It will work. Nice. But then, why not take it a step further? So why not registering it into our dependency injection container, so I don't have to initialize it every time that I'm calling the Pokemon service? So how to do that? We'll go back here and we can do something like this. So builder.services.add HTTP client. Now I'm registering an HTTP client into my DI, and then in my Pokemon service, I can inject the client. So I can remove this one here, and I can use the HTTP client that being injected into my service. And now I can run it, go to the terminal, call it again, it will return data. which is nice. Now, I don't like having my base address here. And basically your base address, perhaps it is a configuration or something. So let's try to remove that from here. How to do that? Let's go back here and implement another type of registration. So I need to add an HTTP client and I'm going to name it. This is a named HTTP client. Let's call it Poke API. The client will be registered here. So I can now do something like client.baseAddress equal new URI with the API URL. Nice. And now to use my named HTTP client instance, I need to change few things here. I will not have to inject an HTTP client. Instead, I will inject an HTTP client factory where I can do something like factory.createClient and you provide the Poke API, the named HTTP client instance, and then we can remove this one from here. Now, let's test it out. Running, and then let's try a different Pokemon now. Pikachu, ID 25, weight 60. So it's working. Nice. So I have a HTTP client factory. I can use named HTTP client, but still I'm creating a client from the factory, which is fine as it is, but let's take it another step further. Go back here and try to implement it as typed HTTP client. Basically, my Pokemon service here is responsible of calling an HTTP client with the Poke API endpoint. So to do that, go here, HTTP Pokemon service, and here you will pass the base address. Okay, so now any instance of HTTP client that's gonna be injected in the Pokemon service will have this implementation with the base address. So I'm using a very basic example here, like it's only the base address, but you will have later on, you can have request headers, maybe authentication, stuff like that. So you can configure them all here in your DI and you only inject the instance of it in your services. That's the idea. But I'm trying to show you the basic example of it. So going back to my service here, let's return that to HTTP client. So HTTP client, and then we can remove this one here, client equal to client, and then you run. Now, let's try to test it out. Oh, we got an exception. Why is that? So you will notice that the request URI, which is basically the base URI, was not defined, although we defined it here. So the order of your registration here matter, meaning you need, let's stop that. You need to register your service, then register your typed HTTP client. Now, if we run it again, after shuffling the order, call back the API, we will get the response. And that's it. That's how you can use HTTP clients in your .NET application from the worst to the best. And let me know in the comment below, how are you using HTTP clients and what is the best way for you? And that's it for me, guys. Make sure to check my other videos here and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.